This is the More to the Story podcast with Dr. Andy Miller.
We hope you guys enjoyed today's conversation.
Welcome to the More to the Story podcast. I'm so glad that you've come along today. And look, this is going to be a fun episode. And some of you saw the title, and this might be a question that you've wondered about for a while. So I hope you'll stay around. This podcast is brought to you by Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we are training trusted leaders for faithful churches. And we have a sense that this doesn't just mean just training people to become pastors and senior pastors in churches. Instead, we have things that we offer for the whole church, people who are Sunday school teachers, people who just want to go deeper in their faith. We have something called the Wesley Institute. This is a several month-long process of working through every book of the Bible. And we're adding to that kind of a Wesley Institute 2, which is an opportunity to go deeper into theological studies. So you can find information about that at wbs.edu, in addition to all of our other academic programs where we offer a bachelor's degree in pastoral ministry, right? That's what we say? My accreditation
It's Christian ministry.
Christian ministry. Yeah. And then we have various MAs, Master's of Divinity, Doctor of Ministry programs. So we hope you'll check that out. Today, I have on the podcast with me one of our very own professors from WBS, Dr. David Schreiner. Dave, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for having me.
So Dave serves as associate in a couple roles. He's the associate academic dean. He's also an associate. Are you associate professor? Mm-hmm. Associate professor of Old Testament. Mm-hmm. So Dave came over to my house last night, and my boys attacked him with their swords, almost. And so, in that moment, when that happened, that just led to an impromptu lecture on Ehud.
Well, it was a bit prodded. You were like, okay.
Yeah, I was.
Share with my kids some information. So I was like, okay.
Look, when you have an Old Testament scholar in the house, what do you do?
Yeah, just
take advantage of it.
Ask him to bore everybody with his lectures.
There was not boredom. There was no boredom. My boys were holding on to their swords, looking up at what iron, and they're here. And then you started talking about. I'm like, look. Old Testament. I'm hopeful that as they listen to you, that they might think, I'd like to do that job. Right?
Maybe. Who knows? Yeah. Maybe.
Learn about Iron Age and spears and all kinds of things.
Javelins and spears. And
So this then led to an interesting discussion too. Like as we went on further, Abby and the kids have been working their way through like studying the Bible themselves in our kind of like our homeschool curriculum. And they're like halfway through Joshua.
Right.
And then the discussion came up.
Which it always does.
And this is, are you used to this?
Yeah, it happens. It comes up a lot. Like, what do we do with this? How do we?
I mean, every Old Testament scholar worth their salt needs to be prepared to deal with, violence in the Old Testament, these type genocide, these type of questions. So, for instance, we just went and we had another after that. After we had a half an hour on Ehud. Then we had half an hour, 45 minutes on Joshua.
Was it that long?
For instance, I don't know. Well, I don't know how long it was.
Oh my goodness!
But I'm not saying that in a discriminating way. It was a great half an hour, and my kids were really listening.
That's
so
good.
I thought if they're listening and they're interested, I think my podcast audience would be as well. So I think you can help them.
Let's do it.
Okay, so for instance, Joshua chapter 10, verse 28. That day, Joshua put the city and its king to the sword, and totally destroyed everyone in it. He left no survivors. And he did to the king, Makeda, as he had done to the king of Jericho.
Right.
So this brings up this question.
Right.
Why would God ask Joshua to conquest the land and totally destroy everything? I mean, what's going on here?
Yeah. So there's a lot going on there.
Okay.
And I will back up and say that this has been kind of a point of recent conversation. It's kind of been revived for a variety of reasons. I'm thinking of Charlie Trim's book that's getting ready to come out they pushed back the publication. It was supposed to be in February. I think it's coming out in March now. It's about this topic in the destruction of the Canaanites or something along those lines. It's published by Erdman's. And it's kind of continuing a lengthy conversation. There's been some ongoing conversation about violence in the Old Testament over the past few years. And anytime you have conversation about violence, it ultimately leads into the book of Judges and the book of Joshua, because particularly with Joshua, many English translations, particularly in chapter 10 and chapter 11, start talking about utterly destroying people, devoting people to the ban.
Yeah.
And it paints for us a picture that's quite disturbing.
Yeah. So let me stop you
yeah.
for a second. So you said just over the past couple of decades, but there's a sense, or just recently. But I mean, there's a way that this has been a topic for
Right.
centuries.
It's a perpetual topic.
It's probably always going to be there. But you're saying kind of like in the academic discipline,
right.
it's heated up
Yeah.
recently. It's become more.
Yeah, everything's cyclical, right?
Right.
You revisit old things, and recently, within recent memory, definitely within the past handful of years,
Yeah.
Particularly 2 or 3, this has come up again. And this is always going to be there because people like Richard Dawkins will point to these passages and talk about the ludicrousness of Christianity and Christian theology, and how can you worship a God who advocates genocide and those types of things. And so there's a lot of straw men that are being created and used for discussion and beaten and will destroy one straw man only to create another one, and we'll beat on him. And so there's all this to say that there's a lot going on here. And while it's very difficult to answer everybody's questions, all the questions I should say that anybody may have, we have to approach this conversation with nuance,
Right.
patience, intentionality, because as I've already mentioned, there's a lot that's going on here. We have to think about not just historical things. We have to think about literary things. We have to think about linguistic things, because they're all converging. They're all converging here.
Right.
And then there's also a final layer onto this of these passages and what's the meaning, and how do we take these passages away for the context of the canon. Because
right.
what are the implications of Jesus and the issue of final judgment day and Orthodox Christian theology. That adds a whole nother layer to it as well.
Right. So let's just start with it then. Like,
Right.
how do we? Is this a good translation? Like, I just read from the NIV. Totally destroyed everyone in it.
No English translation is a good translation
there you
on
go.
this topic.
Okay, that's really important. No English translation is a good translation.
Right.
So what do you mean by that?
Well, this is a word. The word that is, and you can open your own English translation up to this, and you can see what your favorite Bible translation says. Like I said, I'm used to ideas of totally destroy, utterly destroy, devote to the ban. There's that one.
Ban, B-A-N-E,
And yeah, ban.
not the band.
Devote to the ban.
Okay.
And you first read that, you're kind of like, what? Well, there's a reason to that. But anyway, in my opinion, there's no English translation that really does this concept justice, because we're dealing with a family of words, and the noun is harem, and the verb is haram, and it comes from the root het resh mem.
Okay.
And there's no good English translation for this. There's no one-to-one correspondence. This is in my opinion, this word borderlines on the untranslatable.
Okay.
And I often tell my students, well, you get to this, and maybe you should just say God haram them, or Joshua haram them, or something along those lines.
Sure.
Because that signals to me as your professor that you understand the baggage associated with this. There's a lot of baggage here. So that's the first thing we have to realize. There's no good English translation for all of the things that we're going to talk about. And so you really have to be patient here, and you really have to dig deep and really kind of figure out all the nuances involved. So that's the first thing.
So even in like the way you would get to a translation is you would look at it and how it's paralleled in other ancient Near East languages and how it's used. So, I mean, is this word not show up, harem? I can't get my gutturals in there as well as you, but does it not show up?
One of the things that we do, particularly in Old Testament studies, when we're dealing with a difficult concept or a difficult term, is we look to the related languages to Biblical Hebrew. We call these cognate languages, and so we look to see if there's the same word or if it has related words that are used in similar contexts, and those types of things. And this happens all the time. You may look to Aramaic, you may look to Ugaritic, you may look to Akkadian, those types of things, because these languages are all related, some more closely than others. And sometimes you can find this word or its cousins or anything like that used in similar ways, and that helps us. That understands the semantics. Because when you're looking at a word and you're trying to translate a word, you're looking at more than just the word. You're looking at the way the word is functioning at the clausal level, so in relationship to other words, etc. And so in particularly difficult cases, we also look outside Biblical Hebrew or Greek and look for related languages. The problem with this word is that outside of Biblical Hebrew, there's not a lot of occurrences of it.
Interesting.
So there's one occurrence that we have in Moabite on the Moabite stone, and it's actually a very close parallel where Mesha talks about how he harammed the Israelite population and devoted them to Chemosh, his god. So it's actually quite close, but the problem is in the Moabite stone is that you just have one occurrence of it. It's just one. And Joshua, I think this word and its related this root with the verbal form and the nominal form. I think it appears over 20 times.
Yeah,
So it's all
yeah,
over the book of
interesting.
Joshua.
So even in that case, though, the Moabite, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
So like even in that case, though, it obviously can't be the total destruction.
Right.
Right.
Then and that gets into some other things that we'll get into.
Okay, all right.
And,
Sorry to
and
jump ahead
No,
to it,
it's perfectly fine. And so, but from a linguistic standpoint, we just don't have a lot of data to work with, and we don't have the cognate data, and that makes things difficult. So essentially, any attempt to understand what's going on here is reduced to the biblical corpus. Large part.
Yeah,
there's a few others. There's a few other occurrences, one maybe two, that are a little bit more distantly related. Moabite's very close. It's a very close cousin to biblical Hebrew, and so the occurrence at Moabite is helpful, particularly because of all the parallels and how it's used as well. But that's about it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So then if we move away from that, so now, okay, we're dealing with this. So we have a hard time translating this into English. So then how then does the idea of them being totally destroyed miss the point? I mean, is that happen? Are they totally destroyed?
No, I would say probably not. And again, bear with me here.
Yeah.
But there's other things that are converging on this, because you also have to ask the question about the type of literature. What type of literature are we doing? And this, I think, is helpful because while we don't have the linguistic parallels that we would like in the cognate languages, we actually have the literary parallels.
Interesting.
And so we have similar literary types, a similar type of literature that you read in Joshua elsewhere, in Akkadian and other places. This is called conquest literature.
Oh, interesting.
And so royal figures in the ancient Near East would often brag about who they beat up. They bragged about two things, what we built and who we beat up. And so much of royal literature revolves around that. And in the case of who we beat up, they would often go into graphic detail. I mean, you're talking about piles of heads, blood running through the streets ankle deep, and that sort of thing. And it's very violent and it's very vivid, but it's also hyperbolic.
Yes, sure.
And these ancient Near Eastern kings, and we can thank Lawson Younger Jr. for this because he's compiled a very good monograph that juxtaposes all of these similar types of literature and said, look, we're dealing with a recognized literary type, and that's what we have in Joshua.
And now, last night when you're telling my boys this is perfect for them.
Yeah.
Like they're Titus will soon be 13, Andy's 14, and when you said, blood running ankle deep, I looked over at them and their eyes just kind of went up. But then I also saw in them, like as you were saying it, but obviously you said, but this is hyperbolic. Now they know the word hyperbole.
Yeah.
But then it was like, oh, it kind of clicked in.
Yeah.
So you're saying it's like a form of literature, just like you'd have a biography
Yeah.
or poetry. Conquest literature is its own literature that assumes some sort of like movement of exaggeration.
Yeah. There's hyperbole that's involved in the definition, and we do this from time to time. I mean, we will exaggerate details. I'll come home and talk to my wife and tell her a story, and sometimes I'll exaggerate details for rhetorical effect, and that's what it's for. And she knows me well enough to know, like, okay, you really didn't do that, but I get the point. So we do this all the time, and in literature, it's no different. And in these conquest accounts, the vivid detail of the violence is often exaggerated, for rhetorical effect. I mean, you stop and think about that. Think about how much blood has to be running through a street for somebody to walk through that street ankle deep in it. That's a lot of bloodshed. So by definition, there's hyperbole involved. Now, for people who tend to have a high view of Scripture, this can be initially unsettling. Well, what do you mean there's exaggeration in Scripture? What are you talking about? And that's a kind of a tangential conversation. But remember, Jesus used hyperbole as well.
Sure.
And so there's hyperbole throughout Scripture. What tends to unsettle us is the possibility that there may be hyperbole in historical literature.
Right.
And because we like our history of a certain type. We like it cut and dry, Joe Friday, give me the facts, ma'am, just the facts type thing. Well, and the reality is that we have to understand the way ancient history was written, and particularly when ancient conquest accounts were compiled as historical literature, historiographic literature, there was exaggeration involved. So I think that's another element that's converging on this. So do I think people died? Yes, I absolutely think people died. And when you're dealing with death, particularly in the Iron Age, you're going to have collateral damage.
Right.
But does that necessarily mean that Joshua totally destroyed everybody? No, I think that's where hyperbole comes into play. And I think that's what's to be expected in this type of literary account. Again, we're reading the text of Joshua. with an awareness of ancient Near Eastern literary conventions, how they wrote their literature in the ancient world, because they did it a little bit differently than we do. Their history writing looks a little bit differently. And in this case, because it's this type of literature, this is involved.
Yeah. So would it be similar to saying like, this Sunday is going to be the Super Bowl, and I don't know, you're from Ohio. Does that mean you're going to root for the Bengals, or are you a Browns person?
No, I'm not a Browns person. Absolutely not.
Okay. So like, if the Bengals win, right? Yeah. They totally destroy.
Right. They totally destroy
their appointment. Like, but that's not necessarily. They might have won by a large margin. Now, I know these aren't apples to apples type of analogies.
Well, here's a close one for you.
A close one for you. Yeah, tell me.
Think in recent memory, how could the United States declare complete victory in Iraq, knowing full well that they were still an insurgency, knowing still well that they had to clean up the riffraff, but yet they could claim victory for reasons. So we do this all the time in military accounts and military rhetoric. We claim total victory, realizing that all the details aren't necessarily necessarily. So I don't have a problem with the account in Joshua telling us that he totally destroyed or had complete victory.
Yes.
Against the Canaanite population, knowing full well that there were still some of them that
because they
existed.
persisted. They
they
persisted as a people,
and we know
they
this.
come up later in Joshua.
Right? Yeah, and Joshua, the book of Joshua itself seems to recognize this, and that's the other thing about this. Joshua itself will make this statement. The book itself will make this statement, and then also a few chapters later talk about the remaining inhabitants in the land that still had to be dealt with.
Yes.
So you can see how we need to be sensitive to these claims and understand them in the context of conquest accounts.
Sure. So there's also a sense of like the theological meaning of harem and what that could mean and totally destroy.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So this is another. So we have the linguistic issue.
Right.
That's very difficult. We have the literary genre issue, which is the conquest account, which involves hyperbole and a certain way of talking about these types of things. Another thing that is converging on the usage of this word is the theological implications of it, because this word will be associated throughout the book, and particularly the opening 11 chapters. I'm thinking of the raw data. I'm trying to pull it off the top of my head. But I think of all the 20-plus occurrences of haram in the root in Joshua, I think all but one of them occurs in the first 11 chapters.
Interesting, okay.
And 10 and 11 are a big focus, a locus where they appear. But they also appear, there's also a congregation of recurrences around the Jericho episode.
Right, interesting.
So, and for those of us who are familiar with the Jericho episode, we know the weight of the Jericho episode. We know the significance of the Jericho episode, because this is the initial movement into the land. This is their first. This is their first proactive military action, and they're given specific instructions about what to do with Jericho.
Right.
And there's also people associated with Jericho, and they're given specific instructions on what to do. And so I'm thinking about Rahab, who is the Canaanite prostitute, who was technically supposed to be under this haram.
Right. Yeah, she should have been taken out.
Yeah,
right?
She's a part of the indigenous Canaanites, and so she's supposed to be under this classification. And you got to really think about haram as a classification more than anything else. So you can haram people, you can haram cities, you can haram objects. You really do need to think about it as a classification.
So the word, the other translation that you gave earlier, devoted
to the band,
that's helpful to me. It's like it's devoted to this task, devoted to this thing that's against what God wants to have happen. Right. And so in that sense, I can hear it like her work being a part of that.
Haram really classifies something to be used in a specific way. There's a certain set of expectations that are then kind of imparted upon it. So this is why you see it in Leviticus. That book's all about ritual and cult, the way how you handle yourself cultically speaking and those types of things. So we do see this word in Leviticus in a cultic context, and that seems to suggest that when something is harammed, there's a certain set of expectations that cannot be violated that have been that kind of gravitate towards and been put on it. So I think that's a healthy way to think of this. And so Rahab is under this haram. There's a certain set of expectations surrounding her as a Canaanite woman that that are supposed to be adhered to. They're supposed to be honored, and the Israelites are supposed to be obedient to that. But also, when it comes to Jericho, the booty, the plunder of Jericho is also put under this haram classification. And that's specified in the book, and it's essentially you're not to take any of it. Because normally you come upon a city, and one of the things you do is you take the spoils out, and this is part of your payment. You reap the spoils of your work. And God tells Israel, no, you're not going to touch any of that. This is Jericho, this is all mine. And this is where we get into Achan.
Right.
Achan is the Israelite who's a part of the
take some of it,
and he's the story goes that he's walking through Jericho and he sees a coat and he really likes that coat. He thinks it's a great coat, and he takes the coat.
Right. And
he violates the harem. And
harem,
so,
right there.
Yeah.
So he violates the harem,
expectations.
The destruction, the total destruction.
Right.
Yeah. So he's not doing that.
This is hands off stuff.
Interesting.
So he looks at it, likes it to the point where he's going to consciously disobey the classification of all of that. He's going to say, you know what, I'm just going to go ahead and pick this coat up, and I don't care if that's been under the harem, and it's been set aside for God. I'm going to take it home. And of course, this, if you know the story, this is the problem, because by him taking the object that is haremed, he himself and his family become harem. So when they violate the expectations, they put themselves under the punishment of violating those expectations. So it's a very interesting concept. And so what you have in the book of Joshua is this flip-flopping. Because Rahab, the story of Rahab is that she's once a Canaanite who's supposed to be under the harem ban.
Right.
But she ultimately, at the end of the day, is not because of what?
Yep.
Because she is willing to go to the community, go to the spies and say, you know what, I'm signing up with you all.
Right.
I want a part of that, and I'm willing to make this confession, this statement of allegiance. I've heard about your God. I've heard about what he does, and I want to be a part of that. And so by her confession, she basically states, I'm willing to live by your community's ethos. Conversely, Achan, through his disobedience, says, I'm no longer willing to live by your community's ethos. So the lady who was under the harem ban initially is no longer, based on confession and faith and willingness to live by the community's ethos. And the guy who was in the community is pushed outside of the community, subjected to the harem because of his disobedience. And so all of this interaction...
That will preach. Yeah, hold that thought. I mean, I'm telling you, this is why you come to seminary. This is why we need you to come. Like, if you can't hear that and think like, man, there's this contrasting two people of what you do and the nature of confession in the midst of that. I'm telling you. Now, look, I want to encourage folks just to really think about, like, we're still working through this. And this might seem kind of deep, and maybe you get lost for a second or two, but we're trying to outline the depths of what's going on here. It's like not just one thing, not just reading it and saying, oh, this is a terrible God, why would you want to serve it? Instead, let's get underneath this a little bit. So this is in part my encouragement to people to think about studying at a deeper level, and WBBS would be a great place to come. All right, keep going.
And I think that's the key. I think everybody gets fixated on chapter 10 and 11 where it's very quick, it's very rapid fire. Joshua's hareming person after person after person, city after city after city. But we fail to connect it back to Rahab and Achan and the lessons to learn there, because that's the same word. It's the same root family. It's
so
appearing. It's instead of just looking at this thing piecemeal, you have to take it under consideration of the message as a whole. And the message of Joshua as a whole when it comes to this root is it's way more than what you think. It's way more than, well, did you kill him or not? There's something more deep and there's something more rich, because all of these things are aligning and all of these things are converging in those opening 11 chapters of Joshua. This is all related by the recurrence of that root. And so this is a concept that is way more than just, well, is he committing genocide or not?
Right. It's like, are you trusting that God's going to take you where he's promised to take you? And will you take the steps that you need to do that?
So again, we have this is a very complicated conversation to have because of the linguistic issues,
right.
Because of the genre issues. And then you have the issue of the literary message through the context, the message of Joshua as a whole. And we realize, based on the recurrence of this word, that it's way more than just a military action. There's something more deep. And so at the final level that we have to ask ourselves is what makes sense of all of this? How can we use the same word in the context of Rahab and Achan and Jericho, which clearly seems to say something theological, and it seems to be importing a commentary on the nature of obedience.
Right.
And are people within the community willing to live by that ethos and continue to obey, or are they going to choose to disobey? And then a commentary about the people outside of the community and what allows them to come into the community. Well, it's their confession. So it's telling us that there's something more than just a surface level monolithic meaning here. There's something else going on. And what ties, in my opinion, what ties this all together is the book as a whole. What's the book as a whole trying to teach us? And Joshua is, as I tell people, it's more than just conquest. And it's more than just land allotments. Mm-hmm. Because remember, in Joshua, we have those really, really boring chapters that talk about land allotments.
Right.
And that's another type of that's another distinct literary genre. And but it has its purpose in it. But they're in there too. So Joshua's more than just military conquest. Joshua's more than just land allotments.
Yeah.
Joshua, in my opinion, is about defining the community of God in this very critical time. Joshua is set against Iron Age 1, which spans from about 1200 to about 1000 BC. And this is very critical, historically speaking, because around 1150, 1200, Egypt recedes. Egypt pulls back. Up until that point, they were ruling this area with dominance, and they were one of the great ancient empires. And they're forced out due to the collapse of the Late Bronze Age. And so it leaves this entire swath of land ripe for the pickings, and it's crazy. And there are so many polities jockeying for position, and Israel is one of them. And so Israel steps into this context having to define themselves. So Israel is going to lay claim to this land, but they have to define themselves. Who are we? Where do we live? Who do we serve? How do we live?
Wow. That's the point of Joshua.
And I think that's the point of Joshua, because Joshua will revisit this covenantal idea over and over. It's about, Joshua as a book is about identifying who Israel is by means of where are they living, land allotments, how are they living? This is where the covenant idea comes into play, and that recurs in a variety of different ways, particularly the end. Chapters 22 and 23, actually 23 and 24, Joshua is on his way out the door, and he's telling the people to remember the covenant. So that's the ideological framework for the community. So who are we? Where do we live? How do we live? And who do we serve? And it's
not
Yahweh.
just how we got there.
Yeah.
Not just that. That's probably like what people see at first.
And so there is a desire to understand the way of life for this community that's bubbling below the surface. And so when you put all these things together and you put this layer upon layer upon layer, you realize that this word haram is more than just a military term, and it's not genocide. It's a way to have a commentary. It's a way to have comment. It's a way to talk about defining the community and telling everybody that our community expects us to live a certain way. And when we violate those expectations, then there are consequences. And so the shadow of Rahab Aiken, the shadow of the Rahab Aiken contrast, really looms large over this entire concept. And it ceases to be merely just a military statement, but it becomes a theological statement. And of course, the very last layer of this is when you put that in the context of the canon.
Right.
And
Leading
Orthodox,
to Jesus.
in Orthodox theology, we believe that there is, at the end of the day, there will be a set of expectations that we will have to answer for. And those of us who are within the community, the kingdom of God, however you want to say it, and are willing to live by this standard, will continue to remain inside the community. But for those of us who are not willing to live according to that standard, and therefore find themselves outside of the community, well, there are consequences. So there's a lot of layers going on here, and there's a lot of things. So again, does that answer all the questions associated with this? Absolutely not.
Right.
Is this still a hard term? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Is this still a hard concept? Absolutely. But at the very end of the day, don't kid yourself. This idea is not just about genocide.
Right. It's interesting, too, because this gets into the philosophical question based on the problem of evil, too. And I know we're kind of stepping outside of like the literature itself. But there also is this question about judgment in general and not understanding in totality what it means for the fate of the unevangelized. Like, what does it mean for these folks to experience eternity? If we assume that this life is it, well, then this might look pretty bleak.
Yeah.
But we also affirm that there's another realm of existence beyond just this life, and we rest in the judgment of God in that. Like, we're not aware of what's happening there. I mean, what do you? Do you deal with those questions? I mean, how do you think through that yourself?
Well, it's difficultly. That's
Yeah,
you struggle. You struggle with those questions. I mean, these are questions that quite frankly, they haunt us, and they haunt professors because we don't have a great answer for them.
Right.
In situations like these, I lean back onto what I know, and I think the creeds are very clear that we hold to this idea of final judgment, and that's going to happen, and that's a very real reality,
Right.
And I hold to that as well. The details of that, that's where faith comes in, and that sort of thing, and I'm glad that I'm not the one making those decisions and that sort of thing.
Right.
But those are situations where I lean back on what I know,
Right.
and what's very clear.
And there's a responsibility, I think, for what you know and what
Yeah.
you've been presented with.
Yeah.
Like, and even for us on this side of the New Testament, like, we're aware of the full revelation of God in the person of Jesus Christ, and our responsibility to respond to His gracious initiative in time and space. So if that's the case, looking back at how the Amalekites responded. Canaanites here in this situation, how do we end up? We end up thinking of this. Maybe there's something we will never fully know.
Yeah.
But we do have what we do know. We can trust in God's grace. We trust in His goodness, His holiness, and the reality of judgment that's coming, which isn't always a bad word. Judgment brings in eternity. Judgment brings a new creation.
Yeah, right. So I think, and I think what you said is important. We can lean on what we know and what we have. And I think when it comes to this issue of the Canaanites and the judgment, and particularly Joshua, it's not a hopeless message, particularly around a term that seems to be portrayed and such. Because remember, you do have those passages in chapters 10 and 11 where Joshua is chereming and going from one place to another. But you can't have that conversation without also having the conversation of Rahab
Right.
and Achan.
Right.
And so it is a potentially hopeful concept. Because all of these things are tied together in the book of Joshua through the recurrence of that verb or that root, and it's wanting you to have that conversation.
Interesting.
That it's not all doom and gloom. It wasn't all doom and gloom for the Canaanites. They had opportunities, and Rahab symbolizes that. As I say, the definition or the boundaries of the community were definitive, but they were also porous. Meaning you could, if you were on the outside, could find your way in.
Right.
The scripture's littered with examples of that. I'm thinking of the Aramean general as well.
Sure.
Who finds himself having this confession of faith as well. There's a lot of parallels between what happens
through you. All the nations of the world will be blessed. Right. This is it's not just an exclusivist message.
Yeah, but the direction also goes the other way. So those of you who are inside can find your way outside.
Yes.
Based on a variety of things, including disobedience. So the point is that when you get to these statements in chapters 10 and 11, it's not just this robotic, genocidal, ungracious, unmerciful action. You're supposed to understand the implication of what happened to Rahab and Achan. There's a possibility. Yeah, there's a possibility here that these people associated with Makeda and all these other towns, could quite frankly be inside the community at some point based on something like what Rahab did. So I don't see this. I guess the point I'm trying to make is
and it's not historically. I'm you wouldn't, as a historian, you wouldn't look at this and say, yeah, they were all totally destroyed. We're saying we just reminding us that we went back through this. We looked at hyperbole. We looked at the semantic range of the word. We looked at theological meaning of the word. Then we looked at it, kind of the focus of Joshua, then ultimately lead into the New Testament and Christ and the Christian community. So this isn't just referring to it in this very simplistic way.
Right. And we can't fall into the temptation of looking at complicated concepts myopically and through this really narrow lens and everything like that, because we do ourselves a disservice, and we set ourselves up for somebody like Richard Dawkins. And so it's not helpful. And it ultimately undermines our theology, because our theology is one of graciousness and it's one of hope. And it certainly is. Again, the image that I continue to go back to is we have a definitive. Our boundaries are definitive. We know who we are. We know how we live. We know whom we serve. Okay, kind of sounds like Joshua, right? And yet people can move in and out of that based on their obedience, based on confessions, based on faith. And so that means for those of us who are inside that community, we have to continually re-up. For instance, we have to continually confess. We have to continually repent. And we can't blatantly disobey because we don't know the consequences. All it takes is one. Achan did, for all we know, Achan just made that one mistake.
Right.
And that not only undermined him and killed him, but it also had implications for his family as well.
It's interesting. I just preached on Psalm 16, and there's a lot of this kind of language of inheriting the land. You are my portion, my cup. The boundary lines, you're my portion. The boundary lines have fallen in pleasant places for me. Like I think it's alluding back to this same image of taking on the land, coming into land. But I think of the boundary lines for Rahab.
Yeah.
And what that meant for her as she haremed. Yeah. And so when that happens, she becomes a part of the line that brings about the Messiah.
And I think that's like the quintessential statement on this whole thing is not only is she a Canaanite woman, but she ultimately finds herself in the most important genealogy in all of human history. And that's crazy in and of itself. And I think that's kind of the icing on the cake, that this woman, represents a lot. Yeah. And I think she symbolizes a lot. And again, part of the beauty and the oomph behind her symbolism is the fact that she's also contrasted with somebody who was supposed to be in. Achan was supposed to. Achan's supposed to understand this. Like he's supposed to. You're supposed to understand. When you come across Achan, you're supposed to think he should know better. Yeah. And he does, because when he's confronted, it's kind of like, yeah, I did this. Yeah. So, but man, so it's again.
It's really good.
It's a very interesting concept that is so layered and so loaded. And in many ways, it's indicative of a book that is so layered and so loaded. It's way more than just...
Final judgment hasn't come.
No.
And so this interesting thing is like, we can raise our fists up at God and say, how could you let this happen? And there's a sense like I'm hearing this, like maybe this would be wrong, maybe I'll pull it back, but it's almost like God saying, you don't know how I finished the story.
Yeah, well,
you don't know it. You don't know it. I mean, and I know that raises some questions for people, but I think we're seeing here how studying Scripture in this way, the kind of the way we look at words, the way we look at history, the way we look at genre, the way we look at the direction of the book, and what's happening here, and the theological message that's in there. Dave, thanks so much for taking time. You want to say anything else?
No,
I kind of interrupted you.
No,
there.
I think that's fine. I mean,
this is so good. And like, what are some of the classes where we talk about these themes here at WBS? Like Old Testament interpretation? Would you
we cover a lot of this. It's a real quick flyby, but we get into issues of history and the issues of literature, and how do you understand the ancientness of the literature? Because remember, vast majority of God's revelation comes through literature, but it comes through ancient literature, and so we have to, if we really are serious about trying to understand what's trying to be communicated, we have to study these things. And so that's why I encourage my students to, not just think about the conquest accounts of Joshua just as conquest accounts, but also look at them as conquest accounts in the context of the ancient Near East. Because when you start to understand the nuances and the dynamics of how they wrote this type of literature, then you begin to realize, okay, there's something a little bit more going on here. Let's go a little bit deeper in those types of things. So we cover a lot of that stuff in OT 516 interpretation, history of interpretation and stuff. And there are other avenues to look into this with a little bit more depth and detail. But those are the main classes that we emphasize: understanding literature in the context of the ancient Near East.
And our philosophical theology classes to deal with these questions from a philosophical level. So I'm just kind of giving people a little hint of where they can pull this in. And it's not going to be a quick Facebook or tweet where you're going to get an answer.
No, and
so that's an important thing to keep in mind. Let's go a little deeper. Do you really want an answer? Like, do you really want to be educated, or do you just want like a quick response to somebody in the office? Right. And that's what I think we're trying to get at here.
Yeah, I think if you had to boil this down to a tweet-worthy statement, it would be maybe it's more than meets the eye. Yeah. At least on this topic in the book of Joshua.
Or there's more to the story.
There's more.
There you go. Yes. All right, so let me conclude here. Is there more to the story of Dave Schreiner? Some things that not your average student would know, or that people don't know about you. So like I ask this question a lot of folks, and like maybe they like to scuba dive, or maybe they like to do other things. So what is it? What's more to the story for Dr. Schreiner?
About me?
Yeah, about you. Or
I wasn't anticipating this.
What do you like to do with your family?
Well, we like to hike and we like to be outdoors.
Tell us about your family.
So I'm married to Jenny.
Okay.
We met in at church, so it's the typical like, where'd you meet your wife? I met her at church. I can actually say that. So we got married when I was in seminary. We have 3 daughters, Maddie, Bailey, and Lily. Currently, they're 11, 8, and 3.
And you guys like to hit the national
We
parks?
do. We like to go to the national parks, and we were talking about this last night. So we like to be outside. We like to be active. I run a lot.
Okay.
And Jenny was a All-American cross-country runner too. So
Okay.
at Indiana Wesleyan, so she was on a All-American team and everything like that. So she runs a lot too. So we're very active. We like to stay active and that sort of thing. And
Yeah.
when our kids get in trouble, we make them run laps.
It's good.
and those types of things. So yeah, I'm kind of a boring person.
Okay. Well, that's not.
Yeah.
I mean, look what we're talking about.
No,
here.
it's nerd stuff. But you know, I like a good science fiction movie.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm kind of all over the place.
What's
a little
your?
bit.
What's
I
one
like
that comes
heavy
to
metal.
mind?
I like heavy metal music.
Okay. Interesting.
Could you peg me for a heavy metal guy?
I think I could.
You
Because
could?
we're
Okay.
about the same age, and I could see you.
Because most
baggy
people.
pants.
Yeah. No. I didn't know baggy pants.
Oh, interesting.
But I like heavy metal's my jam, which is
Okay.
kind of weird because not many people can say that. But yeah, that's kind of odd. I'd say that's a little bit odd for me.
Well, that's fun. That's good. So there's more to the story of Dave Schreiner. There's
Yeah.
more to the story of Joshua 10.
Yeah.
And we hope you'll check it out. Thanks so much for coming to the More to Story podcast. It's a blessing to have you come along. Look, I just want to let some folks know, like, it's meant a lot to me over the last several months. Many people have reached out to me, wrote encouraging notes, maybe 1 or 2 kind of negative ones, but I really appreciate all of the feedback that we get. And if you find this helpful, this might be something that you could just like share a link to this. One thing I found to be effective, like it's great when people share it on social media because that just like ups the number of views that we get and the way people find us. And people always find out about our podcast when people share. It's an amazing thing that happens. I was talking to 2 people from 2 different continents just last week who wanted to reach out to me to talk about some of the things that are happening in the Salvation Army, the denomination where I serve. But they found out about the podcast because one person's mom just shared a link to them. And so in this case, when maybe you've dealt with this question with somebody in your church or something, maybe it's just a quick like forwarding it via text so that somebody can get a sense that there's some more answers and there's more to story to these type of problems of genocide in the Old Testament than maybe people think. And we think it's certainly the case. So thanks a lot for coming along to this podcast. God bless you.